Welcome to a school called home, a school that grows out of and returns to the conversations that we bring together around this kitchen table here in Västerås, Sweden. And welcome to Homeward Bound, the online extension of our little teaching house. Over the last few weeks, we've been learning a lot about how to share the work we do over these curious platforms of Zoom and now YouTube. So this is the next step in that experiment. 2 weeks ago, we had a live session with the Reverend Sara Jolena Wolcott. Over 100 of you turned up to join us for an evening under the title of When Your Ancestors Are the Problem. And it was a conversation about situating our experience, those of us who are aware in one way or another of being beneficiaries of unfinished histories of colonialism and structural white supremacy and the construction of race. How we place ourselves not just as individuals in this moment, but within a longer story of being descendants and ancestors ourselves in turn. We heard from a lot of you who couldn't make it to that session. So last week, Sarah and I got together and recorded a conversation over Zoom where we went a bit deeper into the background to her work, and also it was a chance to ask her some of the questions that came through from the group in the live session that she didn't have time to answer on that call. So, what should I tell you about Sara? She is a recognised minister in the Quaker tradition. She's an eco-theologian. By her own account, she's also carrying witchy lineages which shape her work. I got to know her when we worked together on a text that became From the Darkness, the essay that she wrote for the 12th issue of Dark Mountain. It's an extraordinary piece of writing about her experiences as a chaplain at Rikers Island jail in New York, about her journey coming from a white American family that prided itself on being descended from settlers who came over on the third ship after the Mayflower, and digging out all of the stories that her family didn't tell about itself. And it's also about her journey from a climate activism that was grounded in an understanding of climate change as something originating from the unintended consequences of the inventions of clever white people a couple of hundred years ago, into a deepening sense of how this mess we're in results from a way of treating the world, a way of approaching the world that is deeply rooted with and tangled with histories of plantations and slavery and an extractive approach to bodies and to landscapes. So a couple of things I feel like I should say before we run the conversation. Firstly, Sarah talks about working with ancestors, and it's pretty clear that this isn't just a metaphor or an imaginative exercise. Now, if that pushes beyond the boundaries of what you can treat as real, then I just invite you to sit gently with what she has to say without feeling the need to decide what you think about it too quickly, and without needing to police the borders of reality too heavily. There's some links that we'll share in the notes that Sarah mentions about practical books and sources that lead into that kind of ancestor work. I'm also going to stick in a link to an essay that I wrote about John Berger, the great Marxist art critic and essayist and novelist and storyteller, one of my heroes. And this is a thing that I wrote about all the passages in his work where he talks about his awareness of the presence of the dead. It's something that people very rarely touch on when they talk about Berger's writing. But it felt like another way of holding the borders of reality open. So the second thing I want to say is just to acknowledge that this conversation is two white folks talking to each other, and the backdrop to the conversation is everything that's happened in America and elsewhere in the weeks since the murder of George Floyd. And with a platform like the one that we're creating here with Homeward Bound, it's clear that part of the responsibility of the many kinds of work that are called for in relation to everything that's been brought more painfully to the surface and all of the possibilities that are also brought to the surface in a moment like this, there is a responsibility to give prominence to the voices of writers and thinkers and artists and activists and culture makers who come from backgrounds that mean that their voices have been marginalised. And clearly that's got to be part of our work as we go further into learning how to be a public platform as well as this little school. But I think there's also work to be done that involves, white folks composting our own shit. And I hope that the conversation that Sara and I have here is a small contribution to that, because she's certainly one of the people who has helped me find a way into this work. So it was first thing in the morning here in Sweden when we sat down to record the conversation, last thing at night for Sara in California. And I started out by asking her to say a little more about the journey that led her into all of this.
It's all about remembering. And I often, when I spell remembering, I use a capital M to kind of jolt us a little bit in the way that the English language can be hard to do sometimes. To focus on the member, the body, this experience of reconnecting, the remembering, coming back together of the human earth body once again. That is our birthright as humans, is this process of remembering. And often the way that story is told is that it's, as you were saying, it's told as a environmental story in which it's about people and place reconnecting. And that's often told, I was certainly taught that by prominent white scientists and philosophers and religious leaders in the very elite education that I was privileged to grow up with. And that story was like the racial justice was always, at least in my generation, and I'm in my late 30s now, it was always a part of that story. That was certainly for my generation, and the generation before me not so much, but certainly for my generation, racial justice was always a part of how we were taught to think about climate change. But the origins, the way in which we tell the origin story, was caught up in the Industrial Revolution, which is very much an English-based story. And the way we tell our origin story, the way we remember our origin story, tells us who we are. It's probably one of the most important mythological stories that every human in every culture works with, right? Is the origin of where we come from. And because that tells us where we come from, tells us why we are here. It gives us the who and the what and the where. And it helps us connect our individual whys with the collective why. My people, my tribe is here, wherever here is, because of whatever the reason is. And this is our place in the world. So it gets to the question of destiny and purpose and dharma, in the Hindic system. What is your place in relationship to the communion of all beings, non-human as well as human? Like, our origin stories help us find our place. And the origin stories that I was taught from my own family were ones that there were only white people involved. And the origin stories that our country tells consistently in America, consistently dismembers and erases Native people, and gives less attention to the story of Black and other brown and people of color, people of culture. So like whiteness becomes such a pervasive culture, it almost has no culture in a lot of ways. And so then culture becomes that which is either high culture or that which is carried and brought through by non-white people. And this is a complex relationship. There was a point in time when I purposely did not want to learn from white people. That was a distinct part of my journey, or I would try to get as far away from white teachers as I could. And I would try not to work for white-led organizations. And at that point, it was primarily just because, like, working international development, I saw how often those organizations perpetuate the problem. And I knew that, like, what we were trying to do in creating a society that could survive climate change was not going to come out of those mindsets, even with the best participatory development frameworks that we had. And we had some really good ones. I was searching for something else. So there was a period of time when I kind of rejected teachers who looked like me, which was an important part of my journey and not what I'm doing now. But there you go. And anyway, that led me to this sort of a pivotal moment when I was in seminary. And I asked some members of the Onondaga Nation, which is in upstate New York, near Canada. I asked some of them, like, how can we help you? How can I be of service? And it was a climate justice gathering. Like, everyone was talking about climate justice. And they said, we need to repeal, we want what we've always wanted. We want to repeal the Doctrine of Discovery. And I kind of looked at them, and I knew what the Doctrine of Discovery was. I had heard about these papal bulls that had led to the colonization of the Americas.
The point at which the church gives its blessing, the Pope gives his blessing to the carving up of the world by the early European colonial powers of Spain and Portugal.
Yes, the first one was in, I want to say, 1453-ish, give it 1452, and that was very specifically to give the power to Portugal to begin carving up Africa and what becomes a transatlantic slave trade. So the first papal bull, the first motion of the Doctrine of Discovery was towards Africa. The second, what we now call the Doctrine of Discovery, it wasn't called that then. It had a whole different set of names. The second kind of set of papal bulls happened in 1493 when Columbus returned from America. I include in that the witch bull, which occurred in 1484, which was about rounding up European women and burning them at the stake for their, let's just shorthand say, for the indigenous knowledge that they carried about how to relate to the earth, and as healers and elders in their communities, and as people who are a threat to the changing power structures of Europe at that time. So I had roughly heard about the Doctrine of Discovery. I had some idea what he was talking about, but I had never heard about it in connection to climate change. And I had never heard about it in connection to anything ecological. And I certainly hadn't heard about it in connection to, like, what I, as someone who was interested in eco-theology and eco-spirituality, was supposed to be focusing on. And I had, thank goodness, I had spent enough time with with studying with non-white folks to know that if an indigenous person told me this is what I need to be focusing on, if it doesn't make sense to me, I should really pay attention. Like, when it doesn't make sense to me, like that's like the signal to listen. like it's like, oh, that's a sign that there's something here I don't get, and I probably have a blinder that I don't yet know what it is. So I had enough experience by that time that comment didn't fall on deaf ear. I was able to hear what was being said to me. And a lot of our work in life, I think, is being able to listen to what's actually being said. Like, so much of our if we can just hear what people are actually telling us, it makes things much easier. We go a lot
Sarah,
farther.
my dear friend Charlie Davies, who I work with a lot and who's very deep in Buddhist traditions and practices, he says karma comes down to one thing: how soon are you going to listen? Because if you listen when you get the little quiet signals and take the point, then you don't get to the point where it's getting louder and louder until your life becomes a car crash.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Jesus says something not quite as Jesus always says, you know, have you ears, do you not hear? Have you eyes, do you not see? And I always feel that that parallel is so beautiful with Buddhist and Hindu traditions that are just like, wake up, wake up, wake up, pay attention to what's going on around you.
So you were in theological college,
Yep.
and you had these various teachers and friends and collaborators, and you were waking up to the idea that there might be something missing from the map that you'd been staring at in your activism up to that
I
point.
had been, you know, working for a good, let's say, I don't know, 10 years, something like that, on these issues, on these questions, 15 years. I knew it was just boggled my mind. And that led me down a rabbit hole. And like, you know, so often, especially for those Americans who are engaged with Indian country, like it's easy, like there's a lot of rabbit holes and they're really exciting and interesting. And like suddenly you're kind of like in an Alice in Wonderland kind of experience. And you start like the world like shapes itself differently, and time looks different, and space looks different, everything around you, the buildings begin looking weird. And like it's a very normal process as people go through a decolonial and they like literally they unsettle their vision and their sound and their senses change. It changes, and and they get to that. First you unsettle, and then a new settling or a new grounding, a new source of ground can happen if you keep going. Some people freak out and they don't keep going, but if you keep going, you can kind of get past. You can learn a new way of seeing the world, and that's a continual process. I'm still going through that process of unsettling and coming to a new place. So yeah, so that kind of led to me remembering the climate change story, reoriginating it into the Doctrine of Discovery, reoriginating the origins of climate change into colonization. And because I had the fortune of knowing quite a number of Indigenous elders and hearing their stories, I also knew that you couldn't tell an ecological story without telling a personal story.
Mm.
And so I started to retell my family history as well. And I started to retell, and you can't tell a personal story without telling the collective story. So I started to retell the national story of where America comes from. And I was able to intertwine the ecological, the national, the personal family story into a retelling of a remembering of climate change. And it was very somatic. It was very, I had a lot of physical experiences and a lot of spiritual, I refer to them as spiritual somatic experiences. Because I feel it, you feel it so much in your body. I'm like touching my body as I say that. And you feel in your breath, my breath changed, and my voice changed during this process. And yeah, there's a physical dimension of change that can occur. And I came to see the land differently. Yeah, so there was a lot of change that I went through as I was writing and rewriting and rewriting.
So
Yeah.
one of the people who you introduced me to through the essay that I edited for you was this Black American theologian, Willie James Jennings, who, as I understand it, has been kind of unearthing the story of the church's role, the role of imperial Christianity in the construction of colonialism and of race. And there's this thought that comes from him that the creation of race, the construction of whiteness and blackness and all of the other categories happens in this void that is created by a dislocation from place. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
So he tells a story in so many beautiful chapters, so many beautiful vignettes, and the kind of what he keeps thrumming in on is that race replaced place. And so this is so, like, when I feel like it's one of those things that I had kind of felt this, I was feeling towards this, and then I read his work and I was like, aha, like this is like what I've been sensing and couldn't put words to. And so the easiest way to explain this, I think, is to tell a story that in a similar way that he tells it, a little vignette, if you would. So, kind of cast your mind back to what does it mean? What did it mean? Like, what was really happening from an ecological human perspective when the slave traders would come into the different parts of Africa? They would usually go inland. They wouldn't. They may have started near the coast, but after a while they went inland. And indigenous people the world over, including in Europe and Native America and Africa, would frequently their identity and their clan and their community would be associated with a particular place, and often place names, and their name might be associated with a place name, or their sense of self would be identified with a particular location. And even for nomadic peoples, they tend to have a particular like width and breadth of being nomadic. And the physicality of the place is absolutely key to their sense of time and their culture. And like it, because if you're living off the land, you have to, right? It's like not that complicated. If your life force and your ability to eat and drink comes from the land, you're going to pay a lot of attention to it. And that land's going to play a really big role in what you do and how you see yourself in the mythologies that you create. So you take a people who have been associated with a particular location, and you violently tear them away. Sometimes people were paid for, sometimes they were stolen. And you force march them. And first they're bound, and Jennings beautifully describes this, first they're bound in jute rope, and then later they're often bound in chains. You force march them, sometimes like, hundreds, if not thousands of miles to the coast, to the ocean, and they're thrown into these huge dungeons. And they could hear the ocean from inside the dungeon. And many of them had never seen the ocean, never heard the ocean. It was not a comforting sound. And I'm pausing because whenever I tell this story, some part of me has some tremor of the horror of that experience. And then they were brought to these lines, and they were forced to go onto these boats. And often in some places above the dungeon, right literally above the dungeon, was a church. And people were baptized, which is to say they were given a new name, a new identity. Jennings talks about it like a horrific baptism, a corruption of the very notion of baptism. And then they were put upon these ships, and some would faint just looking at the ships, just standing in line. And then they would go upon these ships, and they would be taken, and they would all be black. Their identity would be based on their skin color. And on that coastline in West Africa, there was a very clear rubric of who got to which two-legged was put into chains and put onto the underbelly of the ship, which two-legged ran the ship on top, and which two-legged sat on a horse and oversaw the whole thing, making notes in his notebook, recording it for prosperity. and applauding themselves for doing God's will in the world. And that rubric was defined by this thing we now call race and skin color. And so the identity of the person was suddenly not based on where they came from in the same way as it had used to be. The specific locality of the individual territory, the individual land and mountain and river. And of course, the mountains and the rivers, they lost their people too, right? Like it wasn't just the people lost their rivers. The rivers lost their people. And then they were put into a new kind of geographical and physical and familial relationship. The baptism over the waters, where I think roughly 11 million people were put onto those ships and only 10 million survived the voyage itself. And sharks used to follow the ships. The sharks learned, the wildlife changed its behavior. The sharks learned to follow the ships because of the dead bodies that would be thrown overboard. So there's this ecological dimension to the creation of race. And, there are many people who will, obviously the historical trauma that's embedded in the body of anyone whose ancestors went through that is significant, and that the generations of trauma of slavery that followed that moment, that generation, has absolutely impacted how the genes developed. And some of that development included the resistance, included the capacity for people to resist. And we must make sure that we always incorporate the story of resistance along with the story of trauma. It's never just trauma. If it was just trauma, they wouldn't have survived. There's always the resistance. There's always the survival. There's always the beauty. There's always the love. That's always there somewhere. Maybe it's a song that someone sang the child before the child was taken away from her. But that song was heard by the birds and the bees and the trees as well as the people. And that song is still with us, and some people can remember those songs. And so it did terrible things, but it also did terrible things to those people who were not on the boats, but who told them to go on the boats. The people who whipped them, those who committed the atrocity, those who ran the slave ships, those who ran the slave trade, those who bought people and pretended the people were property. Like I don't have any doubt in my mind that they knew what they were doing on some level was wrong. And there's all sorts of interesting studies about why and how. But like what I'm trying to get to is that there was the psychologists call it moral injury. Mm-hmm. When you have done something terrible to someone else, there's a moral injury that happens to your own psyche. And you frequently disassociate. You kind of become a split self. If you do something terrible to someone, especially if you do it again and again and again, like your psyche is changed and is damaged. And that has spiritual, if not genetic, repercussions. And less work has been put onto that, but it is part of our work as people who are inheriting that culture, whether that be biologically inheriting it, as in our ancestors are directly responsible for that, and some of my ancestors were absolutely a part of that, or whether it be we're simply came into this system, came into that more recently and have benefited from it ourselves. Like you don't like both cases, whether you're how long ago, whether your ancestors were directly responsible or not. If you are white-bodied, not in settler countries, which is to say, America, Australia, New Zealand. Or if you're from particularly Western Europe, Eastern Europe's complicated. Then like there's something there to work with for you. And it's each particular place that where the spirits come from, where your ancestors come from, has its own story. Each lineage, each family has their own story of both victimhood and perpetuators. And a lot of people tend to hold on to their victim story. They tend to hold on to whatever tragedy befell their particular ancestors. That's the story they tend to hold on to, rather than the more compassionate, like, yes, my ancestors suffered and so did yours. Right? Like people tend to, it's very common for people to kind of focus on the pain in their own line, because very often people's kind of the victim story kind of determines why they did what they did. But yeah, so Jennings was the first one who really helped me. And so the story that I just told is a variation of a story that he tells, and of the way in which race came to replace place.
So these abstract categories fill the gap of the devastation, the sort of brutal simplification.
Brutal simplification is a good word.
Culture.
It's a new rubric, right? There's like this rubric between, and then of course there was a moral, theological rubric that went along with it, in which white was good and black was bad.
So I just want to tie this quickly back around to climate change, and my understanding, which comes to a great extent from our conversations, of what it means to say that the roots of climate change go back much further than unintended consequences of inventions by clever white people in the Industrial Revolution. Now, I mean, part of that is, as Catherine Yusuf would tell us in Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, as Alf Hornbury in his work would tell us, the Industrial Revolution could not have happened. It would not have been possible or viable without the role played by slavery and plantations and the imbalances that had already been created by the colonial system of the relationship between the center and the periphery. So that's part of it. But another part,
a really critical part. Just want to like underline that thing you just said, because in most of the histories that we're taught, we go to the center and we don't focus on the periphery. However, historically, the plantation, particularly the sugar plantation, was the first place of the monocrop, right? It's the first place that in the monocrop is, that is one of the great symbols of the modern agriculture society. And not just the sugar itself, cane sugar as it was known, but the physical work that the slaves were required to do on the sugar plantations was one that was a new set of time was created, because they had to work. They literally were working around the clock, and they were so a new kind of time labor management was developed on those plantations, and then those ideas were put into practice in the factories in England later. It was first practiced, and there are many who will say that the first capitalist economy as we know it today, in part by which we mean an economy in which all of your goods come from somewhere else, like what you need to live comes from somewhere else, was first on those sugar plantations.
Right.
And we don't center the periphery. We are centering the wrong thing.
So that's one vital part of the story. And the other bit for me is to say, well, why are we in this mess? Is it just a piece of bad luck with the planetary chemistry? Was it just really unfortunate that it turns out that all of the carbon thrown out by the fuels that we've been burning over the last 200 years tips the climate system out of the balance that it's been in throughout what we have called the history of human civilization. If, think of it this way, if the IPCC turn around tomorrow and say, guys, this is really embarrassing. Turns out we did our sums wrong. Panic over, can go on releasing as much carbon as you want, and it's not going to destabilize the climate. Right? They're not going to do that. But if they did that, would it be, oh, okay, sigh of relief, everything back onto a trajectory of progress? No, because it's not just the bad luck with planetary chemistry that leads us into the climate crisis. It's a way of approaching the world, a way of treating the world. And if it hadn't run up against that boundary, it would have run up against others. And in fact, we know, not least from the work at the Stockholm Resilience Centre on the planetary boundaries framework, that it is already running up against multiple boundaries. But this is really important, because then the question becomes not, oh, well, I mean, it's terrible with hindsight, but obviously they couldn't have known at the time when they were inventing these machines and so on. The question becomes, how did it become possible to approach the world and treat the world in the way that then pushes us relentlessly against boundary after boundary? And that, to me, takes us right down into the heart of the story that you're telling.
Yeah. And so to me, it comes to this question of like, what is good? What is goodness in society? Like, I mean, maybe it's because, I'm a theologian. I follow and try to get closer to something that resembles a spiritual path and do some little bit of teaching. And so this question of what does it mean to be a good person? And what does it mean to be close to God? And Christopher Columbus, who you may remember long before he convinced Queen Isabella to give him that ship, he grew up he came from a slave trading family, and he was on slave ships all up and down the coast of Africa as a kid and as a teenager. And so when he said something along the lines of, gold is the most wonderful thing there is. I'm paraphrasing here. Gold can bring you great happiness, and it can even open the doorways to heaven. He was echoing a sentiment that was not from his own mind, but was very much the sentiment of that slave trading family that he came from, and that culture that he came from, in which gold and God were very closely connected. And so you needed to extract by whatever means necessary in order to get the riches, because wealth made you a good person. And private wealth, people were seeking some variation of private wealth, or wealth that would give them security. What is it that gives you security? It wasn't a proper relationship with other people on the planet. It was having enough money to hire people to be your guards, to help you have security. And I've really come to think about this a lot in the past few weeks about this relation, like how do we understand health and safety? We can trace so many of these questions that we're asking today around health and safety hundreds of years, long before the formation of the United States of America, long before the 1600s, long before my ancestors left England. And we can see these tremors of it in these early interactions between Europeans and Africans. And this sort of, like, it seems it's hard for me to fully grasp it. What is it that can enable a human to turn another human into a property to be bought and sold? What is it that enables that objectification? I think we've actually been kind of fascinated with that ever since, but like we've been like that relationship between humans and objects. But that it's such the willingness to turn a human being into a piece of property for the purpose of increasing wealth. And sugar, of course, used to be called white gold. And it made a lot more money for a lot more people than actual like gold did. And certain slave places were known as black gold because you could get so rich off of the slave trade, or the white person could. And all of this, of course, it's not hard to look at the both Old and New Testament and say, I don't know how you got that from anything Jesus said, right? It's like where, like that does not exist. Like these, like a lot of these interpretations, like do not come from the mouth of Jesus. Like who goes around, hanging out with lepers, like, and proclaiming the kingdom of heaven to the poor. And the Beatitudes is just like, it's quite a feat of the imagination. But it was, it had this economic connection to it. And perhaps, there's also this deep cultural superiority, which I think also played a role, this deep fear of admitting that the Europeans who have been through so much trauma, like hundreds and hundreds of years, at least a good 1,000 years of incredible violence on the European continent, amongst themselves, and particularly against poor Europeans, but even the level of royalty, so much violence had happened and hurt people, and through all of that violence, like, I think that they did not trust the humility that could and that these other cultures could meet them as equals, and that something else could emerge, that a more beautiful world could emerge from meeting each other as people, with each side bringing so much wisdom to the conversation. They didn't know how to do that at that moment. Or the ones, let me rephrase that. The people who were on the ships and who had the power did not know how to do that. I think many Europeans were quite capable of that, but they weren't the ones who were in charge by and large.
I think it brings us back around to ancestors and working with your ancestors in the way that you were speaking about with us last week. Because when I hear you tell that last part of the story there, I'm hearing you speak to your ancestors who came to New England in the 17th century, early in the 17th century. And, you've written very movingly about this. So I have questions here that came from people who were in the session last week, but maybe you want to say something first just to lead us into this conversation.
I think there's two things I want to say very quickly, just to make sure that, because I've been teaching around this material for long enough to know that one or two questions that often come up before we begin. And one of them is just that there's nothing about European culture and society, and nothing about the skin color of whiteness that makes it, well, whiteness perhaps, but nothing about the actual skin color, the lack of melatonin that makes Europeans like more prone to empire than other cultures, at least so far as I know. And it's important to recognize that, Africa has had empires, and like empires, and the process of empires and colonization has been something that's been on pretty much every continent. And it's had very similar patterns on pretty much every continent. And in some ways, some of what Europe did is not that unsimilar to some of what some other cultures did. And it's important to recognize that, because it's easy. Sometimes people hear this and they hear that there's something uniquely wrong with with European culture. And it's like, well, no, we are talking about something that's uniquely wrong with humans. like I there's enough checks and balances in the other members of the animal kingdom that this is less likely. Maybe locusts are less likely, but the, you know, there's like there's some of what we're talking about here is seems to be part of human nature, and some of it is a particular time and a particular place, a particular set of technologies, a particular moment in the world, and a particular set of internal notions of cultural superiority, all of which intersected. And the technology that went with it that could enable the extraction and you know, I mean, Romans had their own phrase, Chinese have had their own dynamics of extraction, right? Is not unique. I just want to make this point that it's not completely unique, and it's important to kind of remember that. And then I think the other piece is just to say, like, when we're talking about our ancestors, we need to remember, like when I think actually the first ancestors I really started working with were or like somewhat early in this process, I started working with ancestors who were much older. They were much, much, much older. So in every family lineage, so far as I know, there are ancestors who are whole and complete and perfect and healed and wise. And they carry the wisdom of that ancestral lineage. And sometimes you have to go back a ways. Like sometimes you had to go back a good 1,000 years or more. And you may not remember their names, but like every family has that. Every person has wise ancestors. And they want what's best for all of humanity, and they want what's best for all of the earth. And before them, before the two-leggeds, we are connected to all beings on this planet. And, you know, our plants and the animals and the water, like what that means for all, to be in a relationship, to be in kinship with all other animals and plants means in part that we are literally part of a family. And so we have ancestry we share common ancestors. And I think it's really important to broaden our understanding of ancestors before we kind of go into quote unquote, like the problem ancestors, or the ones that are more challenging for us to work with right now, which who knows, maybe a few generations down the line, we might be those problem ancestors for someone else. But like that, you know, and that's so much of what so many of us want. We talk about this all the time. We want to be good ancestors for future generations. And in order I don't know anyone who doesn't want that. We want the future generations to give them something they can take with them in their journey. And our ancestors want the same thing for us.
So can you just say something briefly about what this ancestor work means for you? What does it look like? How does it begin?
It began because I started feeling my spiritual and ancestral both lineage behind me, and I could feel the women, I could feel the grandmothers going very far back in time. And I could feel them because I was encountering, that was when I was working with the history of the witch hunts. And it was when working with that traumatic period of history where my people suffered, my ancestors suffered. When I was working with that history, and it was a particular type of suffering that I could identify with, I felt them. I began to feel them, became conscious of them. And it was like they were kind of poking over my shoulder and saying, oh yes, we remember that thing you're reading. Yes, no, it didn't actually happen quite like this. Actually, it was a little bit more like that. And they were kind of, I could hear these sort of voices kind of like reading the text that I was reading alongside me, and pointing me to different parts of the books and different parts of the stories that I was hearing. And I felt their love for me, and I felt that there were things that I was being asked to say that they had not been able to say, that their voices have been silenced and their voices have been burned. and their bodies had been burned, and that they were wanting me to have the courage that they did not always have. So I think I started with that, and then as I engaged more deeply with those ancestors, and I would ask them, I would just say, like, why did you, look upon, you write these letters. I was reading some of the letters they wrote about the Native Americans, and they described them so beautifully with such kindness and generosity. And I know they just went around and just killed them and took their land. And like, why would you do that? And the historical work really helped. Like, kind of, there was a lot of historical research that I was doing, which is, now I teach that, all the historical pieces. But the actual ancestral work it came from the need to ask the question, why? That deep human question. And I didn't get a lot of, sometimes I got answers, and sometimes I just got a sense of presence. Like they were just like listening to me answering the question. And sometimes I could also sense all these things that I inherited that were good, like, the capacity for leadership and for being the positive parts of being an explorer, right? And the positive, there's things that I do in my life. There's ways in which I am in the world, which I can like, oh, right. I can look back and I make sense, like who I am and what I do makes sense in the context of the lineage from which I come.
Right.
In a way that it isn't just about my parents and my grandparents, which I'm very different and very similar to, but also very different from my parents and grandparents. But I look at that longer lineage, I'm like, oh, this is why I am the way I am.
Well, this thing about ancestry and making sense, this speaks to me very strongly, because there is this tendency, there's pressure, I think, that comes from the culture that most of us grew up in or around, to make sense of your life on the individual scale, on the scale of the arc of 70 years and 10, or however many you end up getting on the scoreboard. And in the last 10 years or so, for me, it's been a kind of like a drumbeat getting louder and louder, saying, no, this puts too much weight on people's shoulders. Like the scale, the way of telling stories, the way of being, out of which there is a possibility of our lives making sense, is being a small link within a weave of relationship, including but not limited to ancestry, and including but not limited to the genetic track of ancestry, because we've touched on this already. There are also, spiritual ancestors and descendants, cultural ancestors and descendants. Anyone who has been a teacher is likely to have played a role in smaller or larger ways as an ancestor of sorts to some of those who have passed through the experience of being taught by them. So, making our lives start to make sense when we stop treating the past as gone and irrelevant, and when we recognize that the story that we are in is one whose beginning is lost to us and whose ending is unknown to us, and that's okay. That takes the pressure off us to turn this one life into a big story, because it's not. It's a small piece within something.
We're part of a river, right? We're part of a river, and I, I do have a sense that I chose to come in this time in this place. Not everyone does, but I do have that. And that means including being born into this lineage, both my blood ancestry and my spiritual lineage, and the song lines that I carry. And I love my ancestors. And I love, and I don't know anyone who can do this work without coming back to a place of love. like seriously do this work in the kind of depth. And that doesn't mean I don't get angry and frustrated. And there aren't times when I just like, oh my God, I just want to like smack you guys. Like, how could you leave us in this situation? Like, look at all the shit I have to deal with. Like, you know, but there's also this deep love. And I know that like, well, right now I have all those gifts. I have the gifts that they gave me that I have inherited. And I will wield those gifts differently. I am wielding those gifts differently. And my ancestors sat in ceremony with the indigenous people of this land. They sat in ceremony with them. They spoke the songs. They smoked the pipes. And I completely believe that there were moments in those ceremonies when they saw God in the faces sitting across from them. And today, when I also sit in ceremony with the same descendants that my ancestors did, and we can both of us, like their lineage and my lineage, we can trace back our ancestors. We know that they sat together in ceremony. We know they traded the sacred pipe. They passed the pipe between them. We know they traded wampum belts. And like, so now when I do that, I know that I am doing what my ancestors did. And I know I am doing that. That is part of what the sitting together in circle is part of what it means to be American, and is part of my family lineage. And I will claim that. I build something more beautiful off of that. And I will seek to keep the promises that they could not keep.
So there's a question here that came from somebody in the group last week that touches on what we're talking about here. How to move through or reconcile the double trauma of an ancestor having been both coloniser and colonised, a Scottish Hebridean who emigrated to South Africa, and yet knowing very little about the details, even their first name. So,
right, this is a beautiful question. There are very few, if any, families who do not have both the perpetuator and the victim within them. Most families carry some combination of both, especially when we include domestic violence in our understanding of victim and perpetuator. There may be a family where rape was not a part somewhere, but I don't think so. Like there's going to be both violence and love. And there's going to be both victimhood and oppression. So in terms of the specific question that's asked, I don't think you need to know, as I said, like I'm very unusual in how many names I know. You don't need to know the names. You can work with the energies, and you can work with so in general, I think there's a lot of big work that can be done with those kinds of histories. That's really beautiful. But in general, I recommend going kind of slowly into this process and starting with just inviting yourself to especially if you know you want to go deep, you can take your time. They're not going anywhere. And start with getting to know or kind of inviting some ancestral guides, some who are wise and healed, and who want the best for you and for your family today. And that's in part because whenever you're working with anything in the spiritual world, there's always a potential for there's a lot of weird stuff out there. And you always want to protect yourself, and you always want to have some kind of a guide. You always want to ground. You always want to have some kind of circle of protection, even if it's your own family, especially if it's your own family. For many of us, that's true for our living families as well. It's kind of, and to kind of first seek a kind of a guide to support you in this work. And if it makes sense for you to work with others, like other people, living people, that can also be good. To have other people who you're talking to about this, I think can be very, very helpful. So those are kind of like two first things. And then beyond that, those histories are very much alive where you are. And so you can work with the inner, like, and it's very present. The past, those pasts that you speak of are very, very, very present. And you can literally work with the soil. You can literally work with the land and the water, which holds a recent memory. The water holds memory, and it can hold the memory of the disruption and the violence as well as the love. And, you can create a circle of love and invite yourself to be part of the circle of love. And invite yourself to be a part of the water, a part of the circle of waters. And start there. And, pray for assistance.
Are there any good sources that you would point people to who feel like complete beginners in what you're talking about here, who might feel there's something in what Sara's saying that I'm drawn to, but I wouldn't know where to start? No one's ever taught me how to pray or how to ask for ancestral support or any of what you're saying.
Right. So some of my favorite, there's Daniel Foor. He's a kind of a well-known author. He wrote this book called, one of his books called Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. One of the things I like about his work is that he has worked with multiple traditions, and he is trying to offer something that's a bit cross-cultural. And he's one of the few white men who's worked with the Yoruba tradition in West Africa, who has been deeply accepted within that tradition, and who is himself also trying to heal issues around racism. I talked about this a lot in our session. I haven't talked about it quite as much here, like the extent to which this is an embodied thing. So
this is literally the next question, Sara.
Yeah.
So
okay, great. Let's go that. So I know. So I'll say this again, but like I'm all like, there's a lot. One of my favorite podcasts, I'll mention one of my favorite podcasts around ancestral work, is called Bespoken Bones. With Pavali that they are a trans person working with ancestral healing, and do an exceptional job of bringing a wide range of people and a wide range of different people from different ethnic and spiritual traditions. And I can listen to Pavli's voice all day long. Yeah, so it's an incredible podcast.
So we'll put the links for this in the notes on the video and the audio here. So the question and these all came from the chat during the call last week, and we had so many questions that we didn't have time to for you to answer all of them. But somebody asked, can you explain more why the emphasis on the body, its physicality, why this is so important for healing ourselves and society?
Yes, this is a good question. So this is not about figuring it out. The work before us is not, like the slaves were emancipated in the United States in, the 1860s. And we have had a lot of problems since then. And that is because the task before us is not an intellectual one. It's not only about changing policy. It's not only about, although changing policy is important, but it's fundamentally about changing culture. And culture resides in the body and in symbols in the body. It's in language, and it's in the physical world. And all that trauma I was talking about, all that stuff that happened, has been passed down through bodies. It's been literally, this is all about people's bodies. And there's, there was a period, I think, if we look at this historically, in which white America has, I'm talking about America, but this is I'm talking about the world. I'm using America as an example, but I'm not only talking about America. This is not only an American issue by any scope of the imagination. And it started with the mind, attempts to solve the problem often started with the mind, like, oh, we're going to create a better policy. And then it went to and then a lot of work has been done to try to open people's hearts. And that's important. We need to open our hearts. That's very important. But we need to go below that. We need to go below. I'm touching my solar pollex. And we need to go below we need to go deeper into our stomachs, into the instincts. A lot of the racial bias is happening at an instinctual level. It's happening at the level of the gut. Sometimes our gut actually needs to get a little bit rewired and reconstituted to enable us to feel safe, to enable us to be strong, and to not rely upon the police to protect us from the Black body, who has been conceptualized in the gut, not just the mind, as dangerous. And so the vagus nerve plays, like, physiologically, the vagus nerve, which connects the spine all the way, is a floating nerve that goes all the way down to the intestines, but kind of floats around the body, plays a very, very significant role in this. And when I teach on this material, and when in my own process of healing, like, and when I do a lot of one-on-one healing sessions with people, and working with people's, like, there's stuff in their body. I can feel it from every culture. Doesn't matter where they're from. There's stuff in their body that's not theirs. It's not yours. You didn't say you wanted it. It didn't come out of your personal life experience. It didn't come out because it's not your person. It's like you've inherited it. And some of that stuff needs to get worked out. And a lot of it's mind, body, heart connection. But, like, you cannot, I don't know how you can do this work without working on your somatic responses, and including, being willing to be uncomfortable. That's actually is a part of it. Like there's a lot of examples, but like being willing to increase your capacity for discomfort is also some of it.
We need to point people to Krista Tippett's interview with Resma Manikam that just
beautiful,
and to Resma's as well, don't we?
Resma's work is so critical. He doesn't make the ecological connections that we were talking about earlier. He's so popular right now. I'm so happy that he's so popular. So his book, which you may have heard of, is My Grandmother's Hands: Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And part of what he says, and this comes very quickly to anyone who listens to him, and he says it frequently, is that, and this points to one of the things you said earlier, Dougald, is that the mind, there's white bodies, Black bodies. He divides bodies into white bodies, Black or people of color bodies, and police bodies. And he points out that each of these bodies are kind of intertwined in, I would say, distrust and variations of seeing the other as dangerous or anxiety producing. And he very much says that one of the main things that's needed is that each of those groups needs to do some internal work. And and there's a couple of things one should be aware of, especially if you're relatively new on this journey. And one of them is, like, you don't, notice if you find yourself wanting to go to a Black person, if you're a white person, white body, and you want to go to a Black body for comfort, particularly a Black female body. And if you find yourself, like, wanting some comfort in that space, you can question that. You might want to say, what's going on here? Where is that coming from? Just, like, notice that thought and see, is there another way that you can strengthen your capacity for what in the somatic trauma healing spaces we call self-regulation? Can you regulate yourself through the voice and through touch and through being in nature? Can you bring yourself back to a space of safety and comfort without running away? Like, I think that, this is a process, and people disassociate quickly, and they often take quote unquote breaks. And you have to keep coming back to it. And if you do, the more you can come back to this work, like any aspect of the spiritual journey, the more rewarding it is, and the more miracles come, and the more your own healing can emerge, and the more your own ability to be part of this world can deepen.
So here is another question that came from the group. I'm imagining speaking with my white ancestors who might look to me to do the work they couldn't do, and bringing them together with the ancestors of Black people, specifically my husband, so that they might still have the opportunity to apologize, communicate. In this way, they can still do the work. I am still doing the work. Do you have experience with this?
Such a beautiful desire. Once again, I would go slowly, including first making connection with your ancestors and seeing how they are now. Where are they now? Because ancestors are in the living. So for example, when my father passed away, I saw him travel to this other place across a river on a boat, on a canoe. It's like such a classic image. I'm like, oh my God, this is like such a classic image. It's like coming out of all the mythologies. Like, and I had it. Okay, it's real. And I have my experience of my father since he's passed over has been that he is in a much better place now than when he was with me, when he was alive. And he was very sick for many, many years. Very, very sick. And there is a healing that happened on that river as he journeyed over. And he is like significantly better now. Now, I'm not saying I don't know, and I'm not quite good enough to know like if everything's okay, but like I have experienced him opening doors for me, and I have experienced other ancestors who are kind of like, yeah, like they kind of get it. They've evolved since they died, and like they've been watching all this time. Like, yeah, they're actually kind of cool right now, and others less so. And so it's. I encourage you to just to first figure out where your ancestors are, and to talk with your husband about this before you embark on such a journey, and to see how does he feel about this, and how does he feel about his ancestors, and he should kind of do the same thing first and see how they feel about the whole question.
Well, I'm just thinking it's like the amount of etiquette that there is when you bring living relatives together. It's something
exactly.
to take care over and hopefully communicate well together.
Yeah. And also, like, anyone who does energy work, it's very like, who's familiar with other ways of thinking about this stuff. Like, when you're doing energy work, I would not do energy work on someone else unless they ask me to.
Of course.
Right? Mm-hmm. So there's like, it doesn't matter, or unless I get a direct like lightning bolt, like from the Holy Spirit telling me that, which is extraordinarily rare. Like first, like it's delicate, right? Working with other people is a delicate process, whether they're living or dead, and that's certainly true. So be delicate and considerate, and this work for you. There's a lot of steps just with your own people. There's a lot of work just with your people to keep you busy for a little while. We also have a desire to rush into some of these things, and I totally get that. And some stuff can happen very fast, especially right now. Like the portal's open right now for a lot of things to happen very quickly, and like it's okay to go at the speed of grace. Go at the speed of grace.
Well, you know what Bayo Akumalafe says, the situation is urgent. We need to slow down.
That's right.
So here's another question which touches on something which I feel like it's important that we come back to, actually. I'll read the question first and then maybe say one or two things as well myself. My grandma was a Holocaust survivor, and her entire family were killed. I was so very close to her, and I feel I know oppression in my white body cells. And to be honest, I'm finding myself lost in this work, particularly in relation to ancestry, and even knowing who they are and what they may have done, given the persistent uprooting. How can I find out more? My beloved lefty, all too white activist spaces often don't feel safe for me. And I want to acknowledge, because I was the person who was hosting and inviting people in last week, that one of my reflections afterwards, and luckily, the business we're in with Home is a business of learning how to live in relation and building connections. And so people come back to me and we have conversations after a session. And there were a number of people in the group with us last week who have Jewish heritage and who have expressed how difficult it is. I had one conversation with somebody who's very actively involved with Black Lives Matter as a Jewish woman. And she said, it's really hard to find spaces to talk about the Jewish experience within all of this. And there is a fear of, if or when it's my people that they're coming for. I'm not sure that all of the white allies who I see out there on the streets alongside the Black Lives Matter protesters would be coming out to protect us. And I think that there's been a lot of very raw recent experience of the failures of the left when it comes to anti-Semitism, that maybe, another expression that somebody said was, I feel like we are expected to be white when it's time to take the guilt and the blame. But when they come with the guns, we're not white then. And maybe there's something about the multidimensionality of racism and of these structures that needs to be honored with care in the way that we hold these spaces and invite people into this work of dealing with that sense that many of us have, that our ancestors have been, or that the things we inherit from our ancestors put us in the position of being beneficiaries of things we don't even have to notice because it lands on other people whose bodies aren't identified by the color that our bodies are identified with. But I just wanted to bring that in and hold that between the two of us for a bit, because I felt it was an unfinished piece from last week.
Yeah, and it's such a, it came up last week, and I said then Jewish, I didn't say this, and I'll say it now. When we think about the work that, if one was to ask the question that what is the work that white people have to do amongst white people, healing Jewish, Christian, I'm going to include Islamic, although it's not always there, sometimes it is, and it's not, divisions, but certainly Jewish Christian divisions, historically, contemporarily, that divide has been so horrible. It has led so much violence, and like the history of Europe is also, the history of Christian Europe is also a history of how the Jewish people deal with this group who came out of a rabbi, who emerged from a rabbi and then looked down upon, ridiculed, outcasted, and had a very complicated relationship with their own spiritual ancestors. Even as Europe was colonized by the Christians itself, and well over 1,000 years ago, and like those histories, like we have not, Europeans and those of European descent, some of our bodies are white bodies, some of our bodies are non-white bodies today, but all of us with European ancestry, like there's a lot of stuff that hasn't really been dealt with or talked about in that long history. We talk about the Holocaust, but what we're working with here is much older than the Holocaust. It includes the Holocaust, of the Jewish people by the Nazis. But it's much, much older than that. And that distrust is much older. And it's like, very well, there's a good reason for it, right? There's a very, very good reason for it. And that experience that they're talking about of like, if I'm white when it's convenient for me to be white, like that is an experience. You know, I'm European, like I belong except when I suddenly don't belong. That has been an experience of European Jews in different parts of Europe. And that's Eastern Europe, that's Spain, that's many different parts for a long time. Gypsies have their own variation of some of those. The Roma people have their own variation. It's several different groups. It's not just the Jewish people, but certainly the Jewish people have this long history. And it is the relationship, the historical relationship in America between Jews and Native people, and between Jews and Black people, is extraordinarily complex, with incredible beauty and incredible collaboration and incredible hatred and mistrust from both sides. And just to acknowledge the complexity of it first. And I it's like, will you get my back when my back is up against the wall? Like that question. And so we don't often trust that question until it happens. Right? Like, and I have those parts of me that feel that way too. There's you know, the witch's hat in the witch burnings was a derivation of what the Jews were forced to wear during the Inquisition. But there's a direct connection between those two things. It's, you know, like there's, yeah. So I think what I'm saying is, it's true that there's, and Muslim talks about this in his book. He quotes this wonderful study, which, you know, he's quoting that he says, you know, Menachem, he says that when he names three groups when he's talking about historical trauma in the DNA: Native Americans, African Americans, and Jewish Americans, that all have higher than level trauma, historical trauma that they're working with in comparison to the rest of the population.
I've got one more question that came from the group that I wanted to share with you. All my ancestral stories are about oppression and struggle. They were working class white Scottish peasants. As the first generation in my family to escape poverty, I honestly feel more guilt and shame about being complicit in the current injustices we live with, particularly through the time I spent working in international development, foisting the broken story of progress onto the rest of the world. It seems like this goes far beyond the wrongs of colonialism. This is ongoing violence on other people and other living non-human beings. What do we do with the awareness that despite our best efforts and trying to live as morally as possible, we have benefited more from these wrongs in the world than any of our ancestors?
Such a beautiful question. You know, that the development framework comes, as you may know, comes out of the framework of empire, which comes out of the framework of missionaries, and a framework of one deity being supreme over other expressions of the divine. And all of that comes out of, you know, these sort of habits of empire, which were imposed upon the Scots and the Irish by the British, by the English, as the Scots well remember, and the Irish well remember. That history is not far from the surface. And within England, of course, there's those histories of the diversity of the different peoples who have all been lumped together into the English. And I don't know if we've been, sometimes maybe we're benefiting more, sometimes maybe we're benefiting more, maybe we're not. Like there was a lot of benefit that some of my ancestors had. But we are benefiting from these overarching structures of oppression. And you know, having worked in development, having seen some of the terrible things that American tax dollars go towards, having seen and the British, the DFID, supports. I mean, DFID does some nice, good things too, but I hear you, and I feel that challenge, and it's so important not to get too caught up in the guilt and the shame, because then that can weigh you down, and it can become difficult to find movement. It can be difficult to kind of you don't it's like getting too heavy, too caked with mud that you can't move, and to find those people. And I have benefited so much from having colleagues and dear friends in India and Africa and Kenya and Indonesia who have helped me be a co-conspirator with them of how we can jolt and move and find small ways as well as big ways to engage with this question of creating a common home and of being home together, and to kind of get beyond the notions of progress and development and blah blah blah, and just kind of get to that simplicity of being with each other, one person with another person, quietly talking, and let that be beautiful just for that thing itself.
Yeah, there's something about looking for the seeds, the little pockets of hope, the breathing spaces.
Breathing spaces, right.
Things that you can believe in. You don't have to believe this is going to change everything and fix everything. It's enough to believe this is what it looks like when we find ways of being together, being human together, and making life work. And just the fact that there are those pockets and those projects and those corners and
those friendships.
Yeah.
Let's just work on friendship. When Howard Thurman, who's this great he's one of my favorite intellectuals and theologians, he's a Black preacher, and he wrote Jesus and the Disinherited. When he first went to India in the 30s, he went on the pilgrimage of friendship, and that's what it was called, and they toured around India talking to people about what is it to be Black in America, and what is a new way of thinking about Christianity. And that tour changed the course of history in ways that I can trace, but at the time I don't think anyone knew that or could have said that. It was a journey that influenced thousands upon millions of people, and most of us don't know that story, don't have any idea it ever happened. So friendship and kinship. I don't know. I just have this great faith in our ability to move mountains of oppression through the simple acts of friendship and integrity. It's not enough. It's not, as individuals, it doesn't feel like enough to change the system. It can become overwhelming. I totally get that. But it's not our job to be successful. That's not what we're here for. We're here to be faithful and to fall in love with one another. That's all.
Well, Sara, friendship sounds like a good place to start from and a good place to end with for now, to be continued, because I know that we'll be doing more things together in the times ahead. But thank you for this conversation and for the work that you're doing.